straight to the assign line next.
Camera 2, can I have camera 2 next, please?
Stand by on OS 7.
Coming to assign 2.
Can I have the OS for the studio, please?
Okay, everything's sounding good.
Mixing to camera 3.
And presenters ready, please? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
Cut, go bam, cue.
Hello and welcome to the Accrington Academy School Report 2012. I'm Brandon.
And I'm Sophie. In today's show, we have it all.
Witchcraft,
Executions,
spells,
tragedy,
anniversaries.
and a swimming pool.
Yes, that's right, a swimming pool. We have it all.
First of all, we are going to be investigating an exciting new find, a house near Pendle Hill said to be the meeting place of the notorious Lancashire witches.
As this is the 400th anniversary of the execution of the Lancashire witches, we sent our school reporters to find out more from local enthusiast Simon Entwistle.
Welcome to the beautiful Ribble Valley. This is the village of Downham, scene of a most dastardly deed that took place in the year 1612. To our left we have the panoramic views of Pendle Hill. It looks tranquil, it looks peaceful, but way back in 1612, Pendle Hill and the surrounding villages were subject to one of Great Britain's most famous witch trials, the Pendle Witch Trials of 1612. These beautiful villages haven't changed in years. They're certainly great tourist attractions. Now, when it comes to stories of witchcraft and indeed religion, the Ribble Valley is probably the top of the Premier League, really. Just behind me we have Pendle Hill, and a gentleman called George Fox made his way into Pendle Hill, sat down and had a vision of a brand new religion. That religion was called the Quaker movement. So we have witches, we have brand new religions, and the story of the Pendle witches. Pendle Hill has been described as being hypnotic, seductive, but also extremely atmospheric, as you can see. So here we are at Newchurch in Pendle, the very, very epicentre of the Pendle witch story. This is Newchurch Cemetery, where our story really does begin. But we'll turn the clock back to the year 1612, and not too far from here, on Pendle was an area known simply as Malkin Tower, the home of the Demdike family, consisting of an elderly lady called Demdike, her daughter Elizabeth, her 3 children, James, Jeanette and Alison Devise. These people didn't work for a living, they begged, and if people would give them any money, they would curse them, and people were dying of mysterious ailments. Here in Newchurch lived a lady called Bessie Chattox and her daughter Anne Redfern. Like the Demdikes, like the Devises, they also begged for a living. Alison was found guilty of laming a peddler, and she admitted to being a witch. She incriminated her grandmother. She also brought Bessie Chattox and her daughter Anne Redfern into the story, and they were all sent to the city of Lancaster. On Good Friday 1612, the other so-called witches met at this area known as Malkin Tower, the home of the Demdike family. There, James slaughtered the sheep off the fells, and they consumed the sheep's flesh. They brought a huge cooking vessel out called a cauldron, lit a fire beneath it, and the black syrupy liquid began to bubble and steam. And into the air went huge volumes of steam. Into that cauldron went the odd crushed tooth, the odd human scalp, and indeed the odd clay effigy. After this event took place, Roger Noel, the local magistrate, sent a gentleman called Henry Hargreaves to investigate Malkin Tower. There he met young James Devise, Alison's brother, and he unearthed a clay effigy. They say the clay effigy had human teeth, and indeed human hair, which had come from this very, very cemetery. So the whole story of the Pendle Witches now opens. Roger Noel, the local magistrate, had everyone rounded up that had been at the Good Friday meeting of 1612 that took place on the 20th of April. Some of them disappeared, never to be heard of again, but the rest were all found and sent to Lancaster, with the exception of one young girl called Jeanette Preston. Jeanette came from Gisborne. Gisborne was in West Yorkshire, so she was sent to the city of York and found guilty of witchcraft. The other 11 were sent to Lancaster. Demdike died before the trials began, but she did admit to getting out of bed in the early hours of the morning and visiting this very cemetery, and there she would dig and take items from the corpses, etc. The other 10 were all found guilty of witchcraft. They consisted of John and Jane Bullcock, farmers from Blacko, Kathleen Hewitt of Colne, Alice Nutter of Roughlee, James Devise, Alison Devise, Bessie Chattox, Anne Redfern, and a real hero of the whole story, Alice Nutter. Along with them was a lady called Isabel Roby. She came from Windle in St Helens. She wasn't a member of the Penwitch trio, but she was certainly found guilty with them. And they were all executed on the 20th of August 1612 in front of huge crowds at Lancaster Castle. The one thing the witches have done, of course, is brought a huge amount of tourism to this part of the world. And it's one of those stories that just doesn't die away. In fact, this year will be the 400th anniversary of the Pendle Witches. Towns such as Burnley celebrate with 12 double-decker buses, all named after the famous 12 witches. Of course, for me personally, as a tour guide, I find the real criminal here was none other than King James VI of Scotland, who then became King James I of England. He wrote a book of demonology, and that book was all about his own personal paranoia relating to witchcraft. Sadly, his paranoia condemned those 12 to death. Now, as far as buildings surviving from that period of time, we've got Lancaster Castle, we have the home of Jeanette Preston in Gisborne, we also have Alice Nutter's house behind us. Now, out of all the witches, she was the most famous, the most loved, if you will, because she, at the trials, didn't say a word apart from not guilty. It's said that she was a very brave woman, and it's also said, but not documented, that she may have been falsely incriminated by Roger Noel because of her arguments with regards to land disputes. In those days, women weren't allowed to have a brain, women weren't allowed to actually possess a brain, and she was having none of this, and she used to complain about land disputes, and she won every case fairly and squarely. It's said, but not documented, that Roger Noel did in fact get the youngster devised children, Jeanette, to falsely incriminate her as being one of those people at the Good Friday meeting of 1612.
Here with us today is a star of that report, Simon Entwistle. He's a well-known guide who is an expert in horror tours, ghost tours, and also in murder mystery events.
Thank you so much for joining us.
The pleasure's all mine.
Simon, you're clearly a Pendle Witch expert. What is it that interests you in the history of the Pendle Witches?
Every county in Great Britain, of course, has famous stories and legends. For instance, Nottingham and the city of York both claim to be the home of Robin Hood. But here in Lancashire, we're famous for witches. The Pendle Witch story has everything you would associate with a Hollywood blockbuster. If Mr. Spielberg got his teeth into this story, he'd have a box office hit. It's got deception, it's got acts of cruelty, it's got acts of jealousy, and it's also got acts of cold-blooded murder. It's a fascinating story, and if you were to pick 10 stories from Great Britain, I can guarantee the Pendle Witches will be in that top 10.
What is being done to mark the 400th year anniversary of the executions?
There's an awful lot. Lancashire tourism have really picked up in the witches. They've brought an awful lot of tourism into this part of the world. We've got walking festivals organised over Pendle Hill, into Newchurch, into Barley, into Blacko, etc. There's also a statue being erected to one of the most famous of all the Pendle Witches, Alice Nutter, in her home in Roughlee. And only last week I was invited to Sabden to taste a brand new pie called the Malkin Tower Pie, named after the famous home of the Pendle Witches. So there's an awful lot taking place. There's plays in Lancaster, plays in Blackburn, and in the Pendle region, all to celebrate this rather sad, tragic story that has not left the imagination of the great British public.
Could you explain a little more about the recent findings and the implications of them?
I can indeed. Very, very exciting, actually. Very, very exciting. In the Pendlewich story, there's a situation called the Good Friday Meeting of 1612, where the so-called Pendlewiches met. James Devise slaughtered the sheep off the fells of Pendle, and they feasted on mutton that night. The whole idea was to get a potion together. They got this large cooking vessel called a cauldron, lit a fire beneath it, and the black sapy liquid inside began to bubble and steam. And into that black bubbling liquid went crushed powdered human teeth, the odd clay effigy. The whole idea was to get a potion from that cauldron to blow the gates of Lancaster City Castle Jail open and rescue Demdike, Alison Devise, Bessie Chattox, and her daughter Anne Redfern. It didn't actually work. The home was called Malkin Tower, and for many, 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 many centuries, historians have argued as to where Malkin Tower was. Some say it was in Newchurch, some say Barley, some say Colne, some say Sadler's Farm and Blacko. The cottage was found just before Christmas last year. I was invited to have a look at it, and when I got there, I met some very, very professional archaeologists, and they'd dug deep into the cottage itself, taking away all the soil, and they found a bricked-up room. In one of those bricked-up rooms, sadly, they found a cat that had been bricked up alive. The archaeologists, who are highly professional people, they told me that the cottage had been buried for at least 250 years, and they dated part of it to the year 1580, which means it would have stood at the time of the Pendle Witches. I would like to think it was Malkin Tower, but because we didn't live 400 years ago, I really and truly don't know if it is, but that was the famous place of the Good Friday Meeting of 1612, Malkin Tower, home of the Demdike and Devise families.
And could our viewers find out more about this exciting part of our local history?
You're quite right, Sophie. It is exciting. It's fascinating. There's many, many, many books written on the subject. An excellent one by Christine Goodyear. Christine has just written a book that's called Simply 1612. She's a guide at Lancaster City Castle. Exceptionally good. Her book is outstanding. There's also one by Jenny Lee Coburn, and an excellent book on the whole story of the witches, written way back in 1612 by a gentleman called Thomas Potts. And Thomas Potts was clerk to the courts in 1612. And he brought out this best-selling book in 1613 called The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in Lancashire, first published in 1613. And it's his account. He's the only window into the past. We have to rely entirely on his book as being truthful and honest. For me personally, the trial did seem to be very, very biased. The so-called Pendle Witches were not given any form of defence whatsoever. And it's almost as if they were found guilty before they even entered the courtrooms in Lancaster. What they have done, of course, is brought a huge amount of tourism to this part of the world.
Thank you, Simon. It's been great to hear your expertise.
It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
At Accrington Academy, we are all waiting for the opening of our state-of-the-art swimming pool.
Pool and wonder what's going on inside. Well, you don't have to wonder any longer.
Get ready and prepare yourself. Our reporter Tegan has been inside and is ready to share her sneak preview.
Here I am at the Accrington Academy swimming pool, joined with the site manager, John. So, how long has this building process took from start to finish?
The work started in August of last year and will run until the end of May this year. And currently we're in the second phase of the actual works, and as you can see we're stood within the swimming pool, which is currently being tiled, so we're in the closing stages now to get finished.
So, when do you think it will be finished?
The completion date is for the beginning of June of this year, and that's when they'll hand over to the swimming club and the actual school themselves for them to use.
What is the actual size of the pool?
Well, currently we're stood in the deep end, which is 1 metre 950 millimetres, so in your centimetres 195 centimetres deep, and at the shallow end it's just short of 1 metre deep. And it's a 6-lane wide swimming pool, which gives you a 17 metre wide and 25 metres long, so it is a competition pool, so that it can be recorded for Guinness Book of the Records if at the time.
I see there's a seating area. How many seats are being installed?
Basically what there'll be there is a three-tier spectator seat with a region of 150 spectators to see the competition swimming that goes on in here.
Thank you, Joe, for joining us, and back to the studio.
As you may be aware, 2012 marks the anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. This awful tragedy took place on the 14th of April 1912 and resulted in the death of 1,517 people.
We worked with Matt and Lizzie from Twypley High School in Cheshire to explore this great tragedy.
100 years ago this year, the Titanic sank in the North Atlantic Ocean. Unknown at the time that this would be one of the most famous maritime disasters in history. The Titanic is a story known to many. It departed from Southampton and struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic Ocean. 100 years later, relatives of passengers and crew are retracing the route to commemorate their lost family, and a special memorial service will take place on board the ship.
And 100 years later, the Costa Concordia, a more modern ship, has come to the same end as the Titanic. The captain of the Costa Concordia, Francesco Schettino, was responsible for the tragedy off the Tuscan island of Giglio.
It is unknown how the captain let the ship sink, but what is known that 17 people have died during this incident. Captain Francesco is accused of abandoning ship before all of his passengers had been rescued.
He is now facing possible charges of manslaughter, shipwreck and abandoning ship. Two very different sceneries, 100 years apart, but both with disasters.
You might be surprised to hear that the Titanic has local links through a man called Wallace Hartley, who was a bank conductor.
We now welcome back into the studio the expert on everything Lancashire, Simon Entwistle. Simon, could you tell us a little about Wallace Hartley's background?
I certainly can. He was born in Cone, and at the age of 5 he could play a violin. At the age of 12 he could play it beautifully. His mother and father wanted him to work in the local bank in Cone, but music won the day. And he joined the City of Harrogate Orchestra. He then joined the City of Leeds Orchestra, and as a very, very young chap he got a job on a beautiful ocean liner called the Lusitania. Just before his 28th birthday, he received a letter from the Strand in London from the White Star Line, and he was invited down to the Strand. He met the managing director of the White Star Line. "Oh, Mr. Hartley, you've got a marvellous CV. We'd like to offer you a job on our latest vessel, the RMS Titanic. You'll have your own cabin, your own butler, and you'll be playing to the most wealthiest people in Britain and Europe and the United States." He was absolutely made up. He went back to Cone, the local paper, took some photographs. On the front page, "Local boy does well." Of course, he made his way down to Southampton and boarded that great vessel. And as you quite rightly say, way back in April 1912, the vessel hit an iceberg. Well, for 2 nights previously, he'd been, playing in the ballroom, and he went to bed on that 3rd night, and there was a knock on his door from the butler. Sir, there's a problem. We're sinking. We've hit an iceberg." He was horrified. He got dressed very quickly, rushed up to see the captain, Captain Smith. "Ah, Mr. Hartley, the second lifeboat's about to leave. There's a place for you on there. Now, come on, let's have you." "Sir, I can't. You've got women and children on board. And secondly, the orchestra, Mr. Hartley, it's now or never." He turned around and made his way back to the ballroom. He assembled the orchestra, and they played ragtime blues and music associated from that period of time. And this was designed to pacify those people coming face to face with death. One of the survivors that day was a lady called Wendy Slater from New York. She was 21 years of age. She was in the 3rd lifeboat, and she watched the great vessel lurch upwards against the silhouette of a silvery moon. Above the screams of those poor people in the water, she heard a violin playing quite beautifully. It was a tune called "Nearer to My God Than Thee." The vessel plunged under the water. And lo and behold, 2 weeks later, an American ship was making its way past that very, very lifeboat, that very, very iceberg, and they saw a body in the water. "Body port beam." A lighter was launched. They rowed over to the body, who was wearing evening dress, with a frozen arm clasping a frozen violin. The body was pulled onto the lighter, and they searched for his pockets and found Wallace Hartley, Cone, Lancashire. His funeral in Cone attracted 40,000 people, and he was given what was really a state funeral. Of course, in those days, if you were a man and you survived the Titanic disaster, you were classed as a coward. The one thing Wallace Hartley wasn't was a coward. He turned around and walked back to the ballroom, knowing full well he would never ever see Cone again. His body is interred, of course, in Cone, and he's buried with his beloved violin. And the words of "Nearer to my God than thee" are actually on his grave. He was a brave man, and of course one of Lancashire's most famous sons as well.
Thank you, Simon. We really appreciate your time and expertise. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for kindly inviting me, thank you.
So, you've seen it all. Spells, cauldrons, enthusiasts and pools.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you've enjoyed our report.
Just a final thank you to our wonderful teachers, Miss Devonport, Mr Duxbury and Mr Haydock for making this possible.
Now, we shall leave you to get back to your work.
Good afternoon.